Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at this thing in Canada, this decision to pause new applications for parents and grandparents to get permanent residency. And we've got some news articles about it, and then also this crazy Reddit thread where people are just letting loose. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you really get a sense of how Canadians are feeling about, well, immigration, family, all that stuff, how to balance everything, the economy and social needs.
So the big news is that Canada's basically hit the brakes on new applications from parents and grandparents who want to become permanent residents. The immigration minister, Marc, he made it official. And basically what it means is like anybody who's trying to apply now, they got to wait. While government sorts through this mountain of applications they already got, they're saying they're only going to process like a max of 15,000 from 2024. Can you imagine waiting to hear back?
Yeah, and this pause is really a direct response to this massive backlog of applications, not just family reunification, but immigration in general. Canada's 2024 report to Parliament showed, over 40,000 parent and grandparent sponsorships were just sitting there at the end of 2023.
And the wait time. The average processing time for these applications is 2 years. 2 years.
No wonder everyone on Reddit's going nuts.
Right? It's such a long time to wait in limbo.
And that's where things get interesting. You've got people freaking out about healthcare, about the strain on social services, and then you have, the other side that's all about how important family is, how it's a Canadian value to reunite families.
It's like they're trying to juggle a million things at once. The economy, social responsibility, individual rights, even cultural identity.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and when you look at healthcare specifically, there's this concern about the cost, of taking care of older relatives who are sponsored to come here, especially if they haven't paid into the system the same way Canadians who've lived here longer have.
One Reddit user even said it straight up, why is an elderly Canadian who's paid into the system their whole life competing with someone who just got here for healthcare? It's a good question, right? It gets at this fear of whether things are fair or not.
Absolutely, and that's a big part of what's driving this whole debate. But then on the other side, you've got folks saying, hey, these families contribute too. They bring emotional support, they strengthen communities. Some even say it can help the Canadian economy, if skilled workers can bring their parents over, they're more likely to stay in Canada.
Right. It's not just about the costs. And this is where all those acronyms get thrown around, like CPP and OAS. For folks who might not know, CPP is the Canada Pension Plan, and OAS is Old Age Security. These are those benefits a lot of Canadian seniors rely on, right?
Exactly. And understanding those benefits is crucial to understanding, the whole debate, right? This concern about the financial burden on taxpayers, it's often tied to whether sponsored relatives are going to access those benefits without having contributed as much. It's a valid point, and it shows how complex this issue really is. What are the long-term economic effects of all this?
And then, you've got some people saying this is all just a big political game, especially since an election is coming up. One user even said the Liberal Party is going to shrink down to 6 seats.
I mean, that's probably a bit dramatic.
Probably, yeah. But it shows you how much immigration is tied up with politics.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, is this pause really about fixing a broken system, or is it just about getting votes?
It's also important to point out that the different parties in Canada, they all have different ideas about family reunification. Back in 2011, for example, the Conservative Party started this super visa program, which is this alternative way for parents and grandparents to stay in Canada for longer, even if they don't get permanent residency.
Right. It just shows you how many different ways there are to approach this whole thing, this balancing act between keeping families together and, thinking about the impact on everything else.
So we've got this pause in new applications, this huge backlog of old applications, and everybody's got an opinion. So what's next? Well, we're going to keep digging into this Reddit thread and unpack some of those really heated comments. Then we'll look at what could actually be done to solve this. What all this means for Canada in the long run. Stay with us. So let's talk about those opinions you were mentioning, those strong opinions. Reading through this Reddit thread, it feels like people are really on edge, they're worried about the economy, healthcare, and just how fast things are changing.
Yeah. You can definitely feel that anxiety in some of the comments. Some of them are really thoughtful concerns, but then there are others that are, let's just say, pretty intense.
Some people are even saying stuff like, Canada's becoming Little India, or that, Canadian identity's fallen apart. It's a lot.
Right, and it's easy to just dismiss those comments, but I think it's important to try to understand like where they're coming from, what's driving those feelings.
Yeah, like one user pointed out that Canada is still working through applications from way back in 2020. It makes this whole pause thing seem, I don't know, kind of small in comparison. Like this backlog has been building for years.
Exactly. And that makes you think, okay, is this pause really going to fix anything, or is it just going to make things worse later on? Like, what if more people just start applying for temporary visas instead, or, I don't know, doing something even more drastic?
It seems like the government is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? They need to deal with the backlog, but they also have to think about what might happen later on.
Speaking of consequences, one comment that really jumped out at me was about international students who are getting the Canada Child Benefit after only being here for 18 months. It started this whole conversation about how the benefits newcomers get, compared to what people who've lived here longer get.
It's like this whole policy change just kind of opened up this Pandora's box of anxieties about like what's fair and who gets what?
Yeah, yeah. It makes you realize how important it is for the government to be really clear about how things work. Like,
Yeah.
if people don't understand the system, it's easy to feel like things aren't fair, and that just leads to more distrust and division.
And there's definitely a sense in some of these comments that people feel you know, like their voices aren't being heard, like the government doesn't care what they think. Some even said the government is just trying to please certain vote banks, putting newcomers ahead of people who've been here longer.
That's a really concerning sentiment, right? It shows how even when policies have good intentions, they can backfire if people don't trust the process.
One user put it this way, and it's pretty blunt. I'm not spending the next 30 years working and paying taxes so a bunch of elderly PR residents can come in and use our already messed up healthcare system when they haven't paid a dime their whole lives. Like, whoa, that's intense. But it shows you how real this fear is, that the system isn't working for everyone.
It's a good reminder that, immigration policy doesn't exist on its own, right? It's connected to everything else, the economy, social programs, everything. And when people are feeling squeezed financially, those fears about immigration get even stronger.
Yeah, there was even a comment about how asylum seekers and refugees get coverage for things like dental and vision, things a lot of Canadians can't even afford. And those kinds of comparisons, they just make people resentful and they start questioning how we decide who gets access to basic services.
It's a tough balancing act, and it highlights the need for, really clear communication from the government. If people don't get why things are done a certain way or they feel like it's not fair, it just creates more problems.
It's almost like this whole thing, this pause on sponsorships, has become this, I don't know, a symbol of all these anxieties about what's happening in Canada. People are worried about the economy, about the culture, about what it even means to be Canadian these days. It's a lot.
Yeah, and it's important not to oversimplify things, right? There are legitimate concerns on every side of this debate, and it's going to take a lot of listening and careful thinking to find solutions that work for everyone.
One comment that really stuck with me, even though it was kind of cynical, was the Liberals are only doing this now because there's an election coming up. It just shows you how political this whole thing really is, how everything gets filtered through that lens.
Right, even when a policy seems neutral, people will see it as political, and that's dangerous, especially when people already don't trust the government that much.
Oh, and speaking of different political perspectives,
Yeah.
we should mention that the super visa program we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
the one for parents and grandparents, that was actually started by the Conservative Party back in 2011.
Right, right. It's a good example of how, immigration isn't always a clear-cut partisan issue. Different parties might have different priorities, but they all have to deal with the same complicated reality.
It's easy to get caught up in the arguments online. But it's important to remember that everyone's got their own story, their own reasons for feeling the way they do. We got to try to listen to each other, even when we disagree.
Totally agree. The challenge is to get past all the arguing and find some common ground. How do we make an immigration system that's fair and compassionate, but also sustainable for everyone? It's a tough question, but it's one we got to answer together.
And that brings us to the heart of the matter, right? We've talked about the policy change, the backlog, the reactions, the whole shebang. But what can we actually do about it? What are the options? That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the policy, the backlog, all the reactions, the whole 9 yards. But now, what do we do about it? What are some actual solutions?
Yeah, the million-dollar question. There were tons of ideas on that Reddit thread. One that stood out to me was tying sponsorship to how much money you make.
Yeah.
So if you're sponsoring someone who might need more health care, you gotta pay more to help cover the costs.
Huh. Kind of like a means test for sponsors.
Yeah.
Interesting, but wouldn't that make it so only rich people can bring their families over?
Yeah, that's a good point. It might be good for the budget, but is it really fair to say only people with a lot of money can be with their families? And what about families who need help but can't afford to meet those requirements? It's tricky.
For sure. And families are also different, you know? Their finances, how they work, it's not always so simple.
Exactly. Plus, think about this. What if that makes skilled workers not want to come to Canada? Like, if they know they can't sponsor their parents, they might choose to go somewhere else. We don't want to hurt the economy by accident.
Right, right. Seems like every solution has its downsides. Speaking of which, someone else on Reddit suggested letting older parents come, but not letting them use public benefits like healthcare or OAS.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, yeah, it would definitely save money, but it feels kind of wrong, doesn't it? Like saying family's only for people who can pay for it.
And what's stopping those relatives from ending up in a bad situation? If they can't get
Yeah.
the help they need, it feels like that could cause even more problems.
Totally. It's easy to forget we're talking about real people here. These decisions have real consequences for families.
So we've talked about tying into income and limiting benefits. What else is out there?
Well, some people are saying instead of cutting things off, we should be making our systems better. Like put more money into healthcare, offer more language classes, make it easier for newcomers to fit in, basically build things up so we can handle more people.
It makes sense, like a long-term solution, but it would cost a lot of money, right? Is Canada ready to do that?
I don't know. That's for the politicians to figure out. But it's a good question to ask, right? Should we be trying to prevent problems or just react to them after they happen?
I like that. It feels more like we're actually trying to build a better future, not just putting out fires all the time.
Totally. And it shows that immigration can be a good thing for Canada if we do it right.
It strikes me that this isn't just about policies. It's about what we believe in, like what's most important to Canadians. Keeping families together, having a strong economy, a strong sense of community.
I think you nailed it. These debates are really about who we are as a country and what we want for the future.
One comment that really got to me was, for every immigrant you don't let in, that's one more family staying together in their own country. Like, wow. It makes you realize these decisions have a huge impact, not just in Canada, but everywhere.
It's true. We're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about people's lives.
Well, I think we've really explored this issue from all sides. We looked at the news, dove into that Reddit thread, talked about possible solutions. Any last thoughts as we wrap things up?
Honestly, what stands out to me is how complicated it all is. There's no easy answer, no magic bullet. It's about figuring out what matters most, balancing all these different needs, and deciding what kind of Canada we want to live in.
And that's the message for our listeners today. This pause on parent and grandparent sponsorships, it's just one small part of a much bigger story. It shows us how much immigration affects everything, the economy, healthcare, our communities, even how we see ourselves as Canadians. It's something we all need to pay attention to, think critically about, and talk about respectfully, even when it's hard.
Keep learning, keep talking, and keep thinking about what role you want to play in shaping Canada's future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and maybe even gave you some new things to think about. See you next time.